welcome back to the Athlete's Edge podcast. On today's episode, we're going to unpack a recent Instagram post that you made over, I think it was the weekend or early this week, just around your program, the core beliefs and what you value the most. So you listed a bunch of needs on the whiteboard up there. So I want to go through them one by one and address like what they are, why it's important and how it applies to sport, who does it benefit, and some examples of that. So if we start with the top, we have acceleration and force up there. So I guess for that, what is it? And then why is it important? How does it relate to athletes?
Well, we know acceleration is very force dependent. So it most closely relates to your strength qualities. So that's where we see people that get stronger in the gym typically will improve their sort of 0 to 5, 0 to 10 off the back of that. The thing that I think we lose in that is it is still a skill in terms of how we apply that force. So getting crazy strong in isolation doesn't necessarily help if we're still not applying it the correct way. And so when we think of acceleration, what I think about is, can you get into the right postures or positions? Can you apply the force the right way, which is we look at how we switch and how we move, from left to right, and then, that reactivity. So can we apply force in the right time frames? So we've got postures, we've got how we apply force, and then we've got, quickly.
And so when you sort of talk about the application of force, what are some key things when you coach some of our speed sessions that you look for that, I guess, determines a good acceleration?
So to accelerate really well, it's a balance between how you apply force into the ground. So there's a lot of pushing backwards in order to move forwards. But as you know, a core thing we struggle with is that over pushing. And that's why I really like switching as a cue, as well as some of the drills we use, because to switch, you need to push back at the same time you lift forward on the opposite leg. So when we look at acceleration, what's happening is while we're pushing into the ground backwards behind us, the opposite leg is driving forward into a nice big knee lift, which is then setting up that leg to then hammer back down into the ground on the next step. So if you get too much pushing and everything sort of if you get too much pushing onto the ground and you get that tendency to sort of everything move out the back, you lose the ability to raise that hammer out the front, and you can go into this cycle of really high frequency where you don't get the high forces, which is why it's a balance. Because yes, we've got to push back to go forwards, but we've got to not overdo it so that we then the next step and the step after that starts to suffer.
And what does it look like if someone isn't strong enough? Do they tend to come up straight away because they don't have the sort of ankle stiffness or that sort of, I guess, projection? Or what would you kind of say there?
It's a great question, and 100%. So if people lack the physical qualities to be able to do that well, to hold themselves in those positions, to apply force and still resist that gravity and those vertical forces sort of pushing you down into the ground, then yes, they'll either look like they're going to topple over. So to avoid that, yes, they stand straight up. So as a result, they're really upright. They'll typically use really high frequency because they don't have the strength to sort of get in those positions and hold that for that split second in order to reverse it back on the other leg. So they'll just typically, like a hamster on a running wheel, just keep ticking them over.
And why is it so important, I guess, for athletes to accelerate well, especially across field and court sports?
Well, if acceleration is about building speed, most of the time that is going to be really key to either get to the ball to make a play or to be in a defensive action to close space to stop the player getting the ball, which essentially is obviously the key to most sports. And then it's a skill that you've got to repeat hundreds of times. So if you think about how much time we spend on shooting the basketball or kicking the football or shooting for goal, that might happen 10, 50 times, maybe shooting in a game with a netballer, if you're lucky, but accelerations will be in the hundreds. So it's not only something that is really key in the moment to be successful, but it's something that you'll do many times.
And if we move down to our sort of max velocity, I guess, what is that and why is that important?
Well, now we're talking, what's the ceiling? So, when we built speed and accelerated, what's that ceiling? How fast can we actually get to? So a bit more of that open space. Maybe not as important for some of our court sports that don't actually hit top speed, but we talk about a lot of the time in the development space, still important because we're raising that ceiling, and we know it brings a lot of other qualities up, like strength and power. Our kids that do the speed sessions consistently and are exposed to max velocity sprinting typically improve the fastest in the gym. So yeah, there's definitely some transfer back to the gym. It doesn't always work the other way, and that's because we're still talking postures, we're still talking applying force the right way, just now we're more vertical, but now it's really about the time frames. So max velocity running or sprinting happens in really, really short time frames. So you're on the ground for 0.1 of a second, maybe less if you're really quick. And so it doesn't mean you're going to use, absolute peak forces, but it's going to create really high forces because it's high force in a really short amount of time.
And what do those good postures look like?
Well, it's similar to our acceleration. So when we look at max velocity postures, we still want nice drive forward. Now, instead of being on a lean, we just bring it straight up. So we should still see roughly that, close to 90-degree sort of hip lock position. The key here is a lot of that is going to be dictated by things like your pelvic control, as well as what's happening at the foot and ankle. So while we can get away with slight changes, I think there in acceleration as we muscle our way through, what we know is that's going to set up really good postures later on, and it's critical to max velocity. So if you anterior tilt a little bit, then it's really hard to get that lift up the front. So when we talk the pelvic control, when we talk that hip lock, if I anterior tilt straight away without doing anything with my hip flexor, it puts me in that position because I don't control through here. When I tuck under, straight away brings that lift up.
And then so off the back of that sort of pelvic control, I guess what are the consequences of having, instability or that anterior tilt? How does that affect, obviously, our field athletes more so when they hit in top speed, obviously the risk of hamstrings and that kind of thing?
Yeah, so if at high speed we lack that pelvic control, that's where we see a lot of the risk factors for things like hamstring injuries present. And what that looks like, we see a really big swing out the back. So then our thigh really gets in behind our body. As a result, we sort of flick our foot up. We really struggle then to get back through. As a result, we tend to overstride, which also has some links to things like our shin splints, some back issues. And as a result, there's a lot more braking force on the ground, and it becomes hard to get off the ground quick. So not only do we have some injury risk, it typically leads to slower sprinting.
That kind of does flow well into your next point, because it's funny enough, it is pelvic stability. So you've kind of touched on it there about what it is and why it's important. I guess, can you sort of unpack maybe what that looks like in terms of what exercises in the program? How do you sort of coach that? What are some drills that you use?
So pelvic stability, the reason why it's on my needs list in the gym is, one, yes, we want to train it, but I've also got it in there to remind myself with some of the more common lifts or exercises we would use to make sure that I'm picking options that don't work against it. And so the classic there is the barbell back squat. A lot of people don't back squat well, whether it's a strength issue, a technique issue, or a mobility issue a lot of the time. So as a result, to get the extra mobility, they will actually anterior tilt, use their lower back, their lumbar spine to get more extension in order to get to the ground. What are we talking about with sprinting? Well, we don't want that anterior tilt and lower back to extend. We want to control that. So yes, a lot of our core variations, so things like dead bugs, our side planks, a lot of those sort of movements are working on improving the pelvic control and preventing that anterior tilt. But it doesn't make sense for me then to spend 10 minutes on doing that stuff, but then 30 minutes of the gym session was doing the exact opposite and actually encouraging that anterior tilt. We also do a lot in and around making sure that we're strong through our glutes and hamstrings, that our hip flexors are working really well and are nice and strong, so that we've got this balance of these big muscles, because the reason why the pelvic control is so important is the major muscles that drive our movement attach across the hip and the pelvis. So if the pelvis isn't in a great position, that's the anchor for these major muscles. So while we're training all these different major muscles, we're making sure that the pelvic's in a good position, and then we're doing some extra work in and around our core and hip strength to make sure that we're able to get in that position and hold it.
And if we go to the next one down, which is our hip lock, and obviously the pelvic control and hip lock are pretty correlated. If you do one well, you do the other pretty well for the most part. But when you say hip lock, obviously what does that actually look like to start with?
So it links in as well to that max velocity stuff. So for me, hip lock ties the pelvic control, our acceleration and our max velocity posture all together. So with one leg up, one leg extended or straight, can we hold that pelvic position so that's really strong, so that the muscles that attach to that are anchored and able to do what they need to do at really high forces at the right times. So when I train the hip lock, we're either holding pauses, we're moving in and out of it, we're doing a lot of our run specific isometrics where we don't just do a calf raise hold, we're making sure that we're actually in the hip lock at the same time. So why not work on our calf strength in the position that it needs to be in, while we work on the hip in the position that it needs to be in. So like a lot of my stuff is, I'm always thinking, can I get 2 or 3 benefits from this and not just, calf strength?
And I guess what qualities do our athletes need to have to be able to do that well?
In terms of the hip lock?
Yeah.
Yeah. Really good hip lock is driven by really good core control, really good glute strength. You need to have good mobility in and around things like your hamstrings, your hip flexors. It needs good balance on both sides of the joint.
Go to the quality ground and foot contacts. What do you actually mean by that?
So the part of the program, whether that's speed-based and plyometric-based, but even the gym-based stuff, when I mention quality ground contacts or foot contacts, what I'm talking about there is the position that the foot and ankle is in, depending on the drill, and then how long, the time constraint we might set. So for a plyometric, for example, it might be, yes, we want to have a neutral ankle and we're trying to cue, that pop and really quick ground contacts, which is training more that reactive, active muscle stiffness so that the tendon can be really stiff and springy. At other times, we might be looking at it from a point of view of like an ankle isometric where the contact on the ground is, prolonged. It might be 15 seconds of a hold. But what we're doing there is we're getting really specific with the position we want to be in. And because they're holding, we can literally come and I can grab the foot and go a bit high, go here. And then the loading's changing. So instead of it being really fast, we're actually saying, well, let's make this heavy. And now we're looking more at the strain, and the load we can put in the tendon to make it stronger. So on one aspect, we're trying to train sort of muscle stiffness with really quick contacts. And on the other, we're trying to train a really strong, healthy tendon so that when it is in sport and the muscle wants to pull on it, it can not only do its job, but it can do it over 4 quarters and 18 games a season and 20 seasons of footy.
And how does that sort of, improve their running mechanics when it comes to acceleration and top speed?
Yep. So improving the ground contacts, how the foot works and how the ankle, calf, Achilles all work has a big say. And to the point this morning, I said probably the biggest say on young athletes' acceleration and top speed, because as they improve their mechanics and their force producing qualities from around their hip and these other muscles, end of the day, what happens at the ground is going to have a big say on how that force is then transferred through the floor and then projects you forward. So if you generate a lot of force in the ground, but that all gets leaked because you don't have a really stiff, strong foot contact, then all that force, a lot of that force is wasted. Whereas if you can have a really stiff, strong contact, you hit that ground, you hit, you bounce, away you go.
Yeah, and if we go to the next one down, hip extension. So you kind of got their thigh behind trunk.
Yep.
So walk us through that. What do you mean when you say that?
So when I talk about hip extension, I think generally we talk a lot about, obviously, glute strength. Can we go from a flex position into an extended position. That could be ground based, that could be air based, in terms of even some of our switching type exercises. The reason why I mention in my notes around thigh behind the trunk is it's a real skill to be able to get our leg behind our body, but then get it back through. So for example, one of the lifts our kids of all ages and abilities, our young athletes struggle with is the split squat. For a lot, it's a strength issue, but for a lot, it's also a mobility problem. Now, if you can't split squat down with your thigh in a straight line to your trunk without your hip flexor and quad feeling like it's going to tear, then you're going to have a lot of problems trying to sprint, trying to ground ball, trying to decelerate with the proper technique. So there's an element of the front leg taking a lot of the load and getting strong, and there's some extension as you stand back up through that front hip. But there is a big problem a lot of young athletes have to overcome in that thigh getting behind their body, and can they control that? And that's where we see hip flexor and quad strains come from a lot.
Well, what does good hip extension actually, look like, and how does it actually benefit athletes?
Yeah. Well, so good hip extension drives a lot of movements, from jumping to our acceleration to our top speed running, even to our deceleration. So hip extension, our hip extensors working eccentrically to stop our trunk falling forward. The big problem with a lot of programs is hip extension might be in there to a degree, but it's a lot of knee extension, hip flexion dominant exercises. So your squat patterns. If young athletes out there on their own are doing legs at all, a lot of the time it's leg press, squats, that stuff, which doesn't do a great job of developing the hip extensors, particularly in a position where you've got some sort of split set up where that thigh is getting level or behind your body.
And if we move to the next one, so you've got coordination and skill, probably one of the more underrated ones, I would say, especially watching some of our own athletes and a lot of the junior guys.
Yeah.
What do you mean by coordination? Because a lot of people probably underestimate how important it is.
Yeah. So coordination for me is basically smooth, rhythmic movement. Can you move and make it look effortless? And that's, yes, rare. Obviously, the more complex the movement, the harder that gets. So a basic bodyweight double leg squat is a lot easier than doing a single switch, which is a lot easier than doing a triple switch, which is easier than trying to do a run with your hands above your head, or run with the foot in your hand. So yes, there's a progression to that. The reason why I have it in there is, yes, to me it's the pinnacle of athleticism, and it's not trained deliberately very often. I think that's part of our job, is to have it in there, whether that's in our warm up and our movement skills, or whether that's in our exercise selection in the gym. I looked for ways to sort of drip feed that in as much as I can.
Am I right in saying that we do a lot of the coordination skill work, because if they can't do that in a gym or a safe environment, how are they going to execute that skill out in a chaotic environment on game day?
Yeah, absolutely. If you can't do a coordination skill type exercise in a gym environment where you pretty much only have to focus on that exercise, then you've got Buckley's chance of doing that on the field, where someone's trying to tackle you, you've got players calling for the ball, you've got birds chirping at the moment, you've got people over the fence calling your name, like so much distraction that's all brain power that's all bandwidth that takes up how much your brain can focus on a given task, which in the gym, that's where it's a lot easier.
And then if we go to sort of the mobility and control piece, obviously that mobility dictates, I guess, a lot of what we do at the ankle, knee, hip. So what are some of the impacts of, let's say poor mobility? How does that show up in an athlete?
So I have mobility and control, because again, I think it's about the balance. So if you lack mobility, you're going to find it maybe easier to control certain movements, but you're going to struggle to get into the key positions that we mentioned with acceleration and max velocity and deceleration, even kicking. So if you're really tight, you're going to struggle to kick the football a long way because you can't get your thigh behind your body to generate that momentum and get that leg power through the ball to kick it really well. To do that, you might have to compensate, which again links to the hip lock. You might have to arch your back. So now you've the ability for you to coordinate and time that really well is going to be a bit of luck. Does the hip tuck come under at the same time that the leg swing comes through, that the ball drops perfect and you hit the ball in the sweet spot? And that's why some kids will blame their ball drop, but it's actually a mobility issue. It's a coordination problem that then presents as like a football skill problem. Same with basketball shooting. If you're really tight through your shoulders and thoracic, and your coach is saying, no, you got to get that ball behind your head. If you don't have that skill, that mobility quality, then all the coaching and feedback and cueing in the world isn't going to change that. It's a physical restriction. And it goes the same way. You could be hypermobile, but now you're going to struggle to control that. So now when you do take that ball above your head, everything falls out of position and you've just got no power. And again, like I said, it's just by luck that maybe the ball goes in because it all just comes into sync at the right time. But that's less likely. The same with our movement. Like we've got some hypermobile kids and they struggle. Like the knee goes in, their body falls forward. They almost lack that strength and that tone because they're so hypermobile. Their body, just because they have the movement doesn't mean they should use it. And then they struggle to stay away from those end ranges because that's almost what they use to stop movement.
So how can someone improve their control, especially if they are hypermobile, like you said?
It's almost harder than the tight mobility, like the lack of mobility. If you really lack control, then it is a really good gym program. You're going to need a lot of coaching because you're going to need a lot of feedback around, knee down, foot up, chest up. They need constant feedback to know when they're in or not in the right positions.
And if someone does lack control, what are some of the risk factors that they are exposing themselves to, especially at the field?
Yeah. Well, so if we talk risk factors for mobility issues and then maybe control issues, typically the mobility people, if I had to generalize, mobility people will typically have a bit more of the muscle strains because they're tight, more load on the muscle, more muscle pulls. What's potentially worse is the people that lack control or the hypermobile people typically have more shoulder dislocations or subluxations, more of like ankle sprains, more ACLs, that sort of stuff, because the muscles lack the ability to control and take a lot of the load. The joints then have to pick up some of the slack and they may be getting to more vulnerable positions more often.
And we've kind of touched on the next one, which is just sort of expressing that force and that skill. But do you want to touch on anything there?
So when I say expressing force is a skill, that's just, again, a reminder for me when I'm picking exercises that we think of force, and a lot of the research talks about it at the muscle level. So how much, pull can those muscle fibers hold, or how much force can they generate? That on its own doesn't necessarily mean much if you can't apply it. So it still comes back to positions, how you apply force and the time frames in which you do that. At our younger level and less experienced, lower level athletes, it is more general. But as we work our way through, we've got to start to think a bit more about specificity and some of those positions and how they're going to apply force so they actually are better athletes, not just better at the gym.
Yeah. And for the next one, your handwriting's hard to read, but I think it says actively attack ground with sort of glute and hamstring focus. So walk us through that and what you mean there.
So when I say actively attack the ground, it is sort of linking into that hip extension, so our glute hemi type exercises. And so when we're doing our lunge progressions, when we're doing our even squat type movements, it's how do we push through the floor, or how do we prepare for the ground better so that we get better at a lot of our landing mechanics, our change of direction type movements. Because what I see is a lot of young athletes are really passive as they hit the floor. They almost wait for the ground, and then the quad really kicks in so that they don't sink and fall over. The problem with that is we know that really active quads is a risk factor for things like ACLs, because the quad actually pulls the shin forward across the knee, which is what the ACL is trying to resist. Whereas our hamstrings in particular help trying to pull our shin back on our thigh bone, which helps protect our ACL. So if we're a bit more active with how we prepare for the ground, then potentially we have more of a protective movement pattern when it comes to things like ACLs.
And then I know we've kind of talked in the past about the drop jump and how our drop jump testing actually flags.
Yep.
That's sort of around that peak force.
Yep.
So do you want to kind of just touch on that quickly?
Well, the drop jump flag is about, does the peak force occur in that first 20% of when they hit the ground? So obviously the drop jump is off the box, really quick contact, really stiff knee, which is a really vulnerable position for things like the ACL. What we see in our like really kind of stiff, really like typically a bit weaker athletes is they typically flag more consistently because they don't have the ability, even in a really short amount of time, to just have that brief absorption as they hit the ground before then they spring up. It's not something I recommend anyone does, but you see it a bit when you do a drop jump with eyes closed. Because you can't see the ground, you don't necessarily know exactly where it is, you hit really stiff and you can hear it when someone does it. And that's just because the body visually can't get the feedback to say, oh, ground impact coming, start to pre-tension the muscles that need to be pre-tensioned so that you can hit, absorb and spring really quick. As a result, you sort of hit and thud. And that's how a lot of our young athletes move.
And then if we go to our last one to finish, control head position with sort of limit the side lean. What does that look like and what are you sort of referring to there?
It's so when we talk about controlling our head position, it's not necessarily something we have to worry about a lot with the typical gym movements, sometimes a little bit. But in our plyometrics, particularly our lateral type plyometrics, it's something that we often have to cue. And that's because that sway with our head and our trunk has a big impact on what we're doing through our trunk and definitely lower further down the chain with things like, again, knee injury risk. And because there's so much mass up here, that sort of little head wiggle not only gets us off balance and makes executing the skill tough, it actually then shifts our whole weight, which then if we get in the wrong position, you know, we're not in a great biomechanical position to be effective and push the ground away. And as a result, sometimes the knee can get caught in the middle. So it's such a simple thing, like hit head still and where our head and eyes are, but has such a big say in how we perform from a skill point of view, as well as from some of the injury risk things that we look at. And I'm sure people can relate to, you know, coach saying eyes up or, you know, keep your head still, or maybe not so much in like team sports, but especially in things like tennis, in swimming, these things are massive.
So essentially you want your sort of shoulder and head pointing in the direction that you want to go, especially when it comes to change of direction.
A lot of the time, yes. Yep. Whereas typically momentum will take us the opposite. So if I imagine stepping off my left and going to my right, a lot of the time people will sort of wedge that foot in, but they're still going this way as they try and push, which then creates a lot of that torsion type force, so like a twisting force throughout my left hip, my left knee. And if a few other things go wrong, like say I slip a little bit, now I'm in a really vulnerable position with, something that I can't control happening, and potentially, that's where things like knee injuries maybe happen, as opposed to how do I reduce that risk? Now that might still happen, I might still slip, but if I'm sort of leaning away and my momentum's already going this way, I'm much less likely to hurt my knee, as well as I'm probably going to change direction faster.
And so there's a lot there that we've unpacked. So that's a 5-day program that you've kind of designed. So how do you fit all of those sort of needs into that 5 days?
Well, in terms of, talking at the start around, so with a 5-day program, typically how I structure it, what I've got up there is I'll have an acceleration and a max velocity day so that I can get really specific with acceleration and max velocity from a skill coordination point of view, as well as it allows me to link more force dominant sort of horizontal focused exercises for acceleration with a bit more upright velocity, sort of ankle stiffness type exercises for the max velocity day. So then I'm ticking a lot of the boxes already in and around just those 2 days, particularly for our lower body and our speed type stuff. Then the challenge we have with programming is obviously most athletes will be training at least twice a week in the afternoon. So then what I do is the morning, middle of the week. So for Tuesday, Thursday trainers, that'll be the Wednesday morning. If they do like the Murray Bushrangers a Wednesday night, this will be their Thursday morning. That's where I can do a lot of the sort of mobility work through the lower limb. We can do a bit of upper body strength work. We can do some of our tendon resiliency stuff because it's essentially falls into a really good active recovery sort of option anyway. I want to get them into their program across the week, so it's sort of where it sort of probably fits the best to do that then. A lot of so obviously for Monday is, the first day of the week post-game, post-sport. So, it's when people tend to carry a bit of soreness and a bit of fatigue. So maybe we can't have the intensity on our Monday. So it's a great opportunity to do a lot of our, again, core work, pelvic stability work, some of our resiliency work, some of our general strength work. So we can get that in. We don't sort of overcook them, but it's a really, it's almost like an active recovery, but sort of starts the week off well. They're moving well, good mobility, and then we sort of hit the acceleration on Tuesday. And then for some of our real sort of speed and power work, it falls nicely on a Friday because, we're trying to prime for the weekend. So we leave them, leave Friday feeling better than when they walked in. They're fired up, they've done something explosive. We've done fairly specific type things because we don't want to go into deep ranges because of the risk of soreness and fatigue. So we do partial ranges, explosive lifts, jumps, that sort of stuff. And then, they're out and ready for the weekend.
And just, I guess, to wrap up sort of on the primer session, because I know a lot of athletes want to feel fresh and probably have a certain fear when it comes to doing primer sessions just because of the soreness and fatigue that they carry. What are some key factors that, I guess, athletes need to consider? You kind of touched on one there around shortening the range. Is it sort of keeping intensity high, dropping volume? What is it?
So for me, primer sessions are a great training tool. I think people avoid training the day before a game off the back of the belief that doing less makes them feel better. That's, to me, only the case when you're not consistent and you don't do much training anyway. Everyone that's consistent, I find the primer sessions only makes them better. So what does a good primer session look like? It is probably not deep ranges. So this is where you're only using half and quarter depths. We want to try and limit the eccentric movements. So that's where instead of, off a box, hit the ground where there's a lot of eccentric force and then jump, what we'll do is we'll jump from a seated position. So you're already in the bottom position and then you jump up. So you've only got the push part. What we might do with, say, like, a bench press, we might do it off the pins, instead of coming down, creating that eccentric stretch before we go up. We might do a shoulder throw. In terms of, the sets and reps and the intensities, we want to keep the intensity as high as we can, but yes, we want to definitely drop the volume down. So instead of being like a bench press barbell is, 4 sets of 5, it might be 3 sets of 3 from the pins, for example. And maybe it's not quite as heavy because the focus is, can you move that fairly heavy weight, but with max intent, so as fast as possible. You probably don't want to be training for more than 30 to 40 minutes. You want to keep it pretty short ranges, keep it explosive, intent really high, but keep the volumes down, good rest times, and just make it really high quality.
Perfect. And any last takeaways that you want to touch on, or you're pretty happy?
No, I think so. When we think gym and strength, I think that's all laying the foundations. We then look at things like our plyometrics and a lot of our sprinting type drills, and that's a lot of our transfer type exercises. We got to remember that the sport is the true test, and that's the only thing that's really specific. But that doesn't mean I think that the gym doesn't play a role, and we've spoken before, because the hardware is really, really important so that the software can work better. And I think typically when young athletes neglect or aren't consistent with their gym and their speed work, while they might be going okay now, it tends to catch up with them. And it's because, it's about movement quality. It's about coordination. It's about, can you do everything really well, and having a really wide, skill set. Because at some point, it's going to be tested and you're going to need a lot of different skills, and you can't just rely on the one thing.